Good morning. It's Wednesday, September 3rd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 698 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. Mixed messages continue to come out of the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem. We've got vows from top brass that the war will continue until Hamas is completely and utterly dismantled. And then we've got statements from Ron Dermer, the man we all refer to as Bibi's brain, saying that a partial hostage deal, not even a full deal that brings back every last hostage, is something the Israelis are still mulling. It's a complicated landscape here, folks, but suffice it to say, the Israelis don't have one clear strategy. It really does look like Prime Minister Netanyahu is maintaining maximum flexibility until the very last moment. I think I understand why, but in today's media environment, this is going over about as well as a pig on a spit in the heart of the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood Mea Sharim in Jerusalem. Today's guest is Yaakov Katz, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and current host of the Jewish People's Podcast from the Jewish People Policy Institute. He's also the author of several books, including his latest, co-authored with Amir Bohbat, titled While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. I read the book a few weeks ago. It's one hell of a good read. Yaakov and I will explore what he wrote, how the events of October 7th unfolded, the intelligence failures that made them possible, and what Israel's learned from the deadliest day in its modern history. We'll also pick apart present-day regional dynamics, particularly as Israel moves forward with its plans for Gaza City. Stay tuned for that conversation coming your way in just a few. I'm not a big podcast guy. Yes, I recognize the irony in that. I just don't like listening to people who may or may not know what the hell they're talking about. So when I do listen to podcasts, I try to listen to the best Israeli podcasts in Hebrew. Yes, I have that luxury, and yes, I enjoy it. Yesterday, I listened to one from Israel's Channel 12 featuring Ohad Hemel. He's a super smart Israeli journalist covering the Palestinian file. First, the history. This is not the first conquest of Gaza. Alexander the Great, the Crusaders, the British Empire, and Israel have all dominated Gaza at different points in history. The headlines make it seem like some unique moment in history. It's not. The podcast also yielded insights about life in Gaza right now. Gazans fully understand by now that Hamas is to blame for their plight, but they're fighting for survival every day. So getting into fights about the politics of Gaza is not their priority. Whenever the guns do fall silent, we'll hear from those Gazans, inshallah. But until then, don't expect the media narrative to change. The Gaza war is a test of wills. Hamas doesn't want to lose. Neither does Israel. Neither does Iran. So the battles continue. This thing will end eventually. By then, the media narrative won't matter. There will be winners and losers. The map will have changed, hopefully for the better, and the history of Gaza will be written once again. Now for your headlines. Headline 1. The Trump administration is dialing up more economic pressure on Iran. Yes, people, we're talking about more sanctions. Yesterday, the Treasury Department slapped sanctions on an illicit Iraqi network responsible for smuggling Iranian oil. The scheme involves secretly blending Iranian oil with Iraqi oil and then marketing the mix as pure Iraqi stuff. The operation is led by an Iraqi businessman named Walid al-Samarai. Mr. Walid is based in the United Arab Emirates, an ally of the United States that keeps popping up on our sanctions radar. It's a theme. This guy's also a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis. Yeah, that doesn't sound sketchy at all, right? Anyway, Treasury estimates that this network generates $300 million in illicit funds every year for Iran, himself, and his partners. That's a conservative estimate, so the actual amount could be higher. Read the announcement from Treasury. It's pretty eye-popping. They sanctioned al-Samarai and 2 of his UAE-based companies and over a dozen ships and shell companies based in the Marshall Islands. Also, not sketchy, right? All right, headline 2, the Houthis took a beating, and then they raided UN offices in Yemen over the weekend, apparently in response. Go figure. It all came after that Israeli airstrike, or series of airstrikes rather, that killed most of the Houthi cabinet. After that, the Houthis were looking for some Jews to beat up on, but they couldn't find any because they purged them from Yemen years ago. So the Houthis went out and detained at least 11 staffers from the UN. They stormed the offices of the World Food Program, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization, and they snatched almost a dozen employees. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the Houthis seized UN property. It's not clear what they took, but they also attempted to enter other UN sites in Sana'a, which is the capital of Houthi-controlled Yemen. Guterres called on the Houthis to release the UN staffers as well as those previously taken hostage by the Iran-backed terror group. Back in March, the UN reported that Houthis were holding almost half of all UN employees detained worldwide. And the best part of the story is that the UN continues to hammer Israel, which holds exactly 0 UN workers hostage. Go figure. And headline 3. Another European country plans to recognize the so-called state of Palestine. Break out the mussels and fries, folks, because the latest country to join this demented party is Belgium. Yesterday, the country's foreign minister announced that his country plans to recognize the state of Palestine at the upcoming UN General Assembly, or UNGA, as we call it. Belgium will also impose sanctions on 2 Israeli cabinet ministers, designate Israeli settlers as persona non grata, ban the import of products from settlements, and review procurement contracts with Israeli companies. As for Hamas, the Belgian company plans to designate the terrorist group's leaders also as persona non grata. I guess that's a step in the right direction. And it apparently all hinges on Hamas releasing the remaining hostages and relinquishing control of the Gaza Strip. And that's not likely to happen before UNGA kicks off next week. So maybe it's all meaningless. I guess we'll find out, but there's a lot of hot air for something that just may not happen at all. Anyway, bonus headline 4, purported environmentalist Greta Thunberg is trying to send another flotilla to Gaza. Hurrah. The Swedish meatballs vessel departed from Barcelona on Sunday. It returned to port a couple of hours later due to bad weather. For all you atheists out there, maybe there is a God. All right, enough about Greta. It's time to bring on author Yaakov Katz to this program. So let's dive right in. Welcome to the program, Yaakov Katz.
Great to be with you, John.
Great to be with you, and I guess virtually. See you most of the time in Israel. But, we'll do this in 2 dimensions. Let's start with the premise of your book. You and your co-author, Amir Bohbat, make a compelling argument that when we look back in hindsight, Israel made a number of really terrible intelligence-related errors that led to 10/7. So on the intelligence front, and we'll talk about some of the others, but just on the intelligence front, what were those errors?
I mean, they were all over the place pretty much. And what we know, for example, is just in the night between October 6th and October 7th, there was the famous SIM card story where Palestinians, Hamas guys in Gaza were switching out their Palestinian cellular SIM cards with Israeli ones. It was a big number, big batch at once. Israel detected this. Now, why would they need an Israeli SIM card if they're in Gaza? They would only need it if they're crossing into Israel. That set off an alarm bell. Israel detected that they were uncovering underground rocket launchers. That set off an alarm bell. Israel saw that, for example, Mohammed Def, the leader, the commander, the elusive, mysterious guy who ran Hamas's military wing, they were preparing his underground bunker for him and his family. That set off an alarm bell. So there were all these different alarm bells that were going off, but when they were put together and digested and analyzed, it was looked at through the wrong prism. And really the debate came down to, is this a drill or is this an attack? And then if it is an attack, what kind of attack and what would be the scope or scale of that attack? And I think that the real question here is when you take this intelligence that was there that evening, put it together, and then listen back, and you know this better than probably most of the world because you've been watching this stuff for so long, is they told us exactly what they were going to do. They said they're coming for us. They're coming to kill us. They're coming to abduct us. They're coming to rape our women. They said that they practiced this in the open. They trained in mock military bases what it would look like to storm them and grab a soldier, pull them out. We saw it all happening. We saw them build up, but we didn't put the pieces together. And that's the real question of how did that happen?
Yeah, and then I guess on top of that, you've got the reports coming out about, and I always butcher this word in Hebrew, and it's funny, but it's tatzpitaniot, the observers, the young women that they put on the border. They saw what was happening. They reported it, and they were rebuffed, right?
Yeah, I mean, the women soldiers, the tatzpitaniot, who are the spotters, the observers, they're watching the border. This is the most sophisticated, protected defensive border in the world up until October 7th. with multi-layers of fence, with cameras, remote control guns, an underground barrier to block the cross-border tunnels, sonar and seismic systems to detect if a tunnel is even being dug near the border and could potentially be making its way towards Israel. And these women soldiers who were along the border in places like Nahal Oz, which was a military outpost very close to Gaza, were there, and they were seeing things. They were seeing in their area, because they're looking at a very tactical, small, focused area, each of them, but they're seeing different commanders coming that usually aren't there, things that are happening along the border that usually you don't see. I mean, it used to be, the joke was, John, and you know this, that they would say if there was a bee flying near the fence, they would know about it. It was to that resolution. And the women, and we open up the book with them to an extent, because not only were so many slaughtered that morning of October 7th, but 6 were taken hostage. 5 of them, it took a long time for them to come back. The first one was miraculously rescued in an operation a month or 2 into the war, but they paid the ultimate price. They were seeing things. They were warning about it. They were abandoned in their military base. They were taken hostage. God knows what happened to them during that period in Hamas captivity. And they were the ones who were warning, and their commanders shut them down. And because what they were saying did not fit with what we call in Hebrew the conceptia, it did not fit with the paradigm and the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, and I think that really that's the part that was just so angering for me reading your book. But you and Amir also make the assertion that there were military and strategic errors that Israel made leading up to the 10/7 attacks, different from the intel mistakes that were made. So what were some of those errors?
Well, I mean, you're 100% right. And I think that I've come to believe and I call it the we have failed, because really it's across every level and layer of the Israeli government, and from the political echelon down to the defense establishment. And I even, as a journalist and someone who was the editor of a newspaper during a lot of this period in the 8 years leading up to the war, I feel a measure of responsibility as well, that we weren't challenging enough and asking questions enough and saying, but you tell us that Hamas is deterred, but we're hearing what they're saying and they're not deterred. They seem determined. And I think that we as a society on so many layers and levels failed. So look, Netanyahu was the one who, when he came back to office in 2009 with the promise as prime minister, I will topple Hamas, did exactly the opposite when you think about it, and built up this idea that Hamas could be contained, and Hamas does not want war, but it wants economic prosperity. And I just want to say one thing about containment, because it's often thrown around. There were legitimate reasons for Israel to believe that Hamas could be contained. It's easy for us to say that was a fairy tale. And that's what I call it, because it was belief in a fairy tale that a genocidal terrorist group could live alongside your border and everything would be okay. You could just give them suitcases of cash, and that's what they want. But containment was believed for 3 primary reasons. Number one, we had bigger fish to fry. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, let's keep it where it belongs, but let's not go all out, because it will distract us from the bigger issues. And look at the bigger issues. They're big. Number 2 is we were getting messages, and it did seem that Hamas did not want war, that it wanted to grow its economy and it wanted the prosperity. And then number 3 was the technology. We can't ignore the technology. Amir and I wrote a previous book called Weapon Wizards, which looks at how Israel became a high-tech military superpower. But Iron Dome is an example, amazing system, right? Everyone will agree. But that created a false illusion of security, because it turned rockets into mosquitoes you could swat away. And Israelis thought, okay, we keep them there. The fence that I mentioned before and the underground barrier, amazing. But how many people crossed in on October 7th through a tunnel? 0. So the technology gave us a false sense of security, helped us create this containment policy, but it was wrong.
Yeah. A lot of lessons learned. And I think we can all see it in retrospect that Israel missed a lot of signs. But what about now? I mean, present moment, right? Exactly where we are at this moment as we speak. Are there errors that Israel is making that could prevent future catastrophe? Or rather, are there things that Israel can do right now that could prevent future catastrophes?
First of all, we have to say the obvious, and that is that October 7th is a coin with two sides. One side is what we write about in the book, and that is how did we get to this point, not just on the eve of October 7th, but in the 30 years that ran up to it. And as someone like yourself who's written about the evolution of Hamas over the years, you know how many warning signs there were, right, along that way. So that's important for us to learn. But the other side of this coin is the re-engineering of the Middle East that has transpired in these last almost 2 years. Iran's nuclear facilities, its enrichment process taken down, Assad falling, Hezbollah beaten back, now deterred. The new reality on the ground in Gaza, that if only we could find that political resolution with which to end the war, we could capitalize and leverage the military accomplishments that the IDF has achieved on the battlefield. But one of the lessons, and we see this playing out now, and I commend the Israeli government on this, is the understanding that we cannot go back to a previous policy of containment. We have to operate now according to a policy of preemption. That's one of the recommendations that we actually make in the book. And what I mean by preemption is we see it every week. Israel attacking targets, for example, in Lebanon just a couple of days ago, another target in Lebanon. What is that about? That is because when Israel sees a target, sees a movement of weapons or bad guys who are moving somewhere or infrastructure that's being put together by Hezbollah or someone else, they will now take it out. In the past, until October 7th, the policy was, we'll write it down, we'll add it to the target bank, but we're not going to do anything about it because we don't start wars over conventional military threats. That has now changed, and that is very important. Iran, what Israel did with Iran, was very important. It is part of that preemptive policy now. This is a new change. It's a dramatic change I think people don't pay enough attention to for Israel as it goes forward.
And that, by the way, I think is at the heart of what Netanyahu is trying to do right now in Gaza. And a lot of people are very critical of it. And they're saying, well, take the win. You've already defeated Hamas. From a military perspective, there's very little that Israel can still achieve. However, if you're still seeing threats mounted from Israel's perspective, or at least from the perspective of some in Israel, with this idea of just not letting threats linger, the idea is to go back in there and pound some more. And I do think that that's, to some degree, at the heart of the current debate right now in Israel. And it's an interesting one. And I'm not sure that I know who's right yet, even if I feel, kind of in my kishkas that maybe this is a war that Israel should wrap up. They're still actually applying the lessons of 10-7 there. And I think that's interesting. But let me ask you, at the end of your book, you identify several steps that Israel can take now to set things on the right course. What are those, or maybe what are the most relevant? I know you have a long list, but as you think about those prescriptions right now, what are the most important for folks to understand?
Well, I think they're all still very relevant. And I agree with everything, by the way, you just said. I'm also torn on what's right, by the way, in the path forward. We need military pressure. We need to keep fighting Hamas, but we need that political resolution. Now, but for people to think, by the way, that this war can end and Israel could just walk away and suddenly the hostages will be handed over, that's ludicrous also. That doesn't work. Military pressure is a necessity. So it's a mixed bag. Both sides are potentially right here. We have to play it out and see what happens. But
it's so Israeli, by the way, right? I mean, the fact that there's no answer and everybody's going to just argue ad nauseum, that seems like something very Israeli.
We are quite good at that. But but looking to the future, I want to give it just a taste of three. One is intelligence, right? Until now, Israel's intelligence agencies are split up into two categories. There's the Mossad and the Shin Bet, which are under the purview and authority of the prime minister, and military intelligence, known by its Hebrew acronym Aman, which is under the IDF and the defense minister. Now, they're supposed to be very well coordinated and have a flow of information and intelligence between one another. But as you all can imagine, it doesn't work like that always in practice. Not to mention the fact that if you have a prime minister from one party and a defense minister from another party, that could sometimes mess things up in how they coordinate better. We can't have this anymore. This is unacceptable. To make a comparison, after 9/11, the United States Commission set up the DNI, the Directorate of National Intelligence, which the idea was, we could argue whether it's right or wrong, it's done a good job or hasn't, but the idea was to put all the intelligence agencies under one house to coordinate with one another. We need intelligence reform. That's one. Two, I think we've all seen in this war, Israel has seen definitely, and those like yourself who cares deeply about this, is how integral and existential the relationship is with the United States, whether it's President Biden or it's President Trump who's in office. We have to retain this relationship, and we have to keep and preserve this. Look what's happening right now at Israel, around the world, with all of Europe turning against us. As long as we have Trump, we're pretty much okay. But if we lose Trump, game over. We need to keep this all together. And then number three that I'll just add is we mentioned the preemption. So I want to end with what I think is really the most existential, is the unity of the Israeli people. In the run-up to October 7th, and this is the soft power, we were ripping ourselves apart on the streets of Israel. Judicial reform, we were fighting about the override clause and how we appoint our Supreme Court justices. Not that I'm saying it's not important. These are important issues. But we took our eye off the ball. We exposed ourselves and made ourselves vulnerable. And I was asking a simple question at the time. Not that I had any idea what was happening, but if we saw this in Iran, that they're on the streets and hundreds of thousands of people are fighting, would we not want to fan the flames just a bit to achieve our geopolitical goals in Iran?
Well, point taken. I'll just say point taken, but that's happened. And Israel didn't actually take advantage of this, but yet Israel's enemies did.
Yeah,
and I think that
did. And that was us exposing ourselves and making ourselves vulnerable. We can't afford to allow that to happen again. Unity, it's not just a nice warm word that makes you feel all warm and fuzzy. It really is of existential importance for your national security.
Yeah. And I will say, by the way, as you talk about these things that, Israel needs to consider, it is possible that Israel loses unity, loses the United States, and wins the war. And, is 1 out of 3 kind of what you're going for here? Because it doesn't sound good to me. You kind of need all of those, right? And, I do think that's going to be a major challenge for Israel moving forward. I want to be respectful of your time here. I know you're launching a book and you're traveling. Just if you would, for a minute, before we let you go, talk about the role of the Qataris and how you view them right now. Because, you've heard me say it. You and I have talked about it. The arrangement that we have here in the United States with the Qataris is insane. These are people that are financing and bankrolling, Hamas and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and the Muslim Brotherhood. And then the Israelis come in and they're like, oh yeah, we'd like to work with you to help secure the hostages that are being held by a terror group that you guys finance and host on your soil. What is the logic here? Can you justify this?
The Qatari situation, or the Israeli relationship with the Qataris, is very weird and strange over the years. And you know a lot more about this than probably most people. On the one hand, they are harboring terrorists who want to murder you and I, right? On the other hand, Israel is going there and has intelligence ties with them and works with them. And over the years, and I tell this in the book, when Israel was fighting against the financing of Hamas and trying to stop the flow of money from Iran to Hezbollah or to Gaza, and was going all over the world, even to places like the UAE, to run operations by the Mossad, Qatar was off limits because of those intelligence relationships that we had. When it came after 2014, after Operation Protective Edge, 50-day operation, and Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the recognition, we have to change this. It can't continue the way it was. And the Emir of Qatar comes to Gaza, starts to throw money at the people there. That's where the idea starts to come. Maybe we could get them to actually give some money. And Israel, the Qataris aren't wrong when they say, but Israel asked us to do it. Israel wanted us also to give money. It's a mixed bag. Could they have cracked down more on Hamas, who they're harboring, after October 7th? 100%. Could they have done more to get the hostages home by now? Also 100%. But Israel also has not been clear on what it is that it wants out of this relationship and how it views the Qataris. And I think that this fog creates this lack of clarity It's not a way to run policy in a government, especially with an actor. Are they an enemy? Are they not an enemy? America says they're one of their greatest non-NATO allies. So what are they? And that makes a very difficult situation.
Yeah, and that fog, we have it here in the United States, just as the Israelis have. We always say, when we sneeze, Israel gets pneumonia. And so we started here with, allowing the Qataris into the alliance structure. Looks like Israel followed suit, and now everybody's paying the price. Literally everybody.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Yaakov Katz, congrats on your new book. And thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you.
Hi, that book, folks. Really a terrific read. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today in the English language Lebanese outlet. This is Beirut. FDD's Hussein Abdul Hussein pushes back against the common claim echoed throughout the Arab world and among Israel's critics that Israel is unyielding in the peace or ceasefire talks. Hussein argues that what's often dismissed as intransigence is actually caution informed by experience. Israel's insistence on sequenced agreements, security first, concessions later, is not a refusal to negotiate, but a wise strategy forged by history. Getting burned a couple of times will typically inform that. Meanwhile, my colleagues Mark Montgomery and John Hardy have a compelling piece in the Wall Street Journal on the urgent need for President Donald Trump to reverse the Pentagon's policy of restricting Ukraine from using U.S. ballistic missiles and British cruise missiles against Russian targets. Allowing Kyiv to strike back without constraint wouldn't just allow Ukraine to flex its muscles, it would raise the cost for Moscow and hopefully push it closer to ceasefire negotiations, serious ones at that. Finally, catch the latest episode of FTD's Foreign Policy, where host Cliff May sits down with British historian Mark Galati to explore Putin's imperial ambitions and their role in Russia's aggression against Ukraine, its broad hostility to the West, and more. All right, it's time to pack this thing up like an encampment tent after a campus police raid. If you're looking to read more brainy content, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X, or watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. It's never too late to make a meaningful tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode of your favorite morning show. It'll be day 700 of this war. Hard to believe that. Our guest will be Israeli journalist Emily Schrader. You've probably seen her all over the news and on social media, and maybe you remember her last appearance on this little program. Emily's Iran-obsessed and right on point, so there's no excuse to miss this one. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.